This has been a part of me for the past 20 years. And I'm telling everyone's story, everyone that went through this that day. I was off that day on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. It was my day off, and I was called into work at 4:30 in the morning. I worked for United Airlines, and I was the in-flight coordinator, which means I checked in the crews, the flight attendants, for their departures. That day, I checked in several flights that morning, very early in the morning. I was at the airport about 5 o'clock in the morning that day. I checked in several crews and sent them off on their departures. And Flight 93, the crew checked in with me, and I spent some time with that crew. There were 5 flight attendants. Um, there were one that got put on the plane at the last minute because she was a reserve flight attendant. She was a new hire, and someone called in sick that day. Her name was CeeCee, so we had to put her on the plane that day. And she lost her life, unfortunately, on that plane that day. Um, the other flight attendants, Wanda, came in with heart palpitations, and she thought about calling in sick that day. And we discussed it, and she was going to go to the doctor in San Francisco and see United's medical doctor in San Francisco. So she got on the flight that day. Um, I spent about a half hour talking to the crew on flight 90 for flight 93 that morning. Debbie, one of the flight attendants for flight 93, was very excited that morning. She had just had a year free of melanoma, and she was really excited. She came behind the counter and gave me a big hug, and she was so thrilled that day. Her melanoma was gone, and we were excited. We were just reminiscing about her going through her skin cancer and stuff. And she was in a particularly good mood. And Sandy, one of the flight attendants for Flight 93, was just coming back from maternity leave. She had just had her baby, and her husband, Phil, was a pilot for US Air. And she talked about this being one of her last flights because she was decided to stay home with her baby. And it was all kind of bittersweet, thinking about all of this after the plane crashed, the conversations I had with these women before their flight. And I put this all in my book. I wrote a book about, I started journaling, the day of 9/11. I started journaling everything. And it's very dear to me. I filled several journals, and then I turned it into a book about my experience and everything that happened during 9/11 in the airport and in the in-flight services office. Next thing happened was the flight left about 20 minutes late. That's how they were able to call on the ground, because the flight was delayed about 22 minutes. Um, the next thing I know, I was sitting at my desk, and a Chicago flight attendant, I was still checking in flights. A Chicago flight attendant came running to my desk, and she said, "Oh my God, a plane just hit the World Trade Center," which she thought was the World Trade Center. And I said, "What?" And I ran to the crew lounge, which was next door. And she said, I said, that was the towers. And we watched in horror as the second plane hit the towers, which I saw was a United plane. And I ran back to my office and got my supervisor, and we all, scurried back to the crew lounge, and we watched on TV as I think it was MSNBC was showing it live. The planes were hitting the towers. Um, Before you know it, the phones were ringing off the hook. They were going crazy. From the flight attendants were calling in wanting to know what planes had crashed. The next thing I know, there was a call from Phil Bradshaw, Sandy's husband. And he said Sandy had just called and said that their plane was being hijacked by 4 men with box cutters and red bandanas. And and that call was just horrifying. Okay, let me just take a breath. The call, what do you say to a call like that? We were just, it was horrifying. And so the calls proceeded to come in. I ran, we told the supervisor. Before we knew it, there were terrorist task force agents in front of us at our desk. There were men with guns and dogs, and these army guys standing in front of our desk. There was a bus in front of our, and the tarmac level was my office. It was the in-flight, we were at the in-flight services office, the onboard services office, and it was level with the tarmac. So they had pulled a bus up to evacuate all of the flight attendants out of the office. And they left us in the office. So the gentleman evacuated all of the flight attendants out of the office, and we continued to take calls. And they were expecting more hijack calls to come in. So these terrorist task force agents were putting up signs on what to ask when the hijack calls came in. They wanted to know where everyone was located on the plane. And we found out with the next calls that came in, Sandy was the one that called in next. That Lorraine and Wanda were in fact ministering to passengers, which I thought was really beautiful. They were in the back of the plane ministering to passengers, and Sandy and CeeCee were so brave that they were in the back with Todd Beamer and some other passengers. I believe they had fire extinguishers, and they were filling the passenger carts with cans and Coke bottles, and they were going to bombard the cockpit. And I very vaguely remember any of the other calls, but I very vividly remember those calls, the one from Phil and the next one coming in. And then from that point on, there was, once the flight attendants were evacuated, we started looking up, well, I started looking up flights to see what the flights would show. And immediately it showed record secure. And normally when you look up a flight in the computer, you can pull up the flight attendants' names, who's on crew for that flight. Well, it showed for flight 93 record secure. And we knew, oh my God, this is really happening. You can't get into the records. So the FAA had put in record secure for that. So we knew that they were really being hijacked. This was really happening. So the next thing, Terry, the station manager, made an announcement over the PA and said, all station managers report to the crisis center. So we knew this wasn't good. So our manager, Linda, ran upstairs, and all the managers went upstairs and left us at the desk to man the phones. They called someone from upstairs to help me man the phones. And the phones were ringing nonstop, and it was all flight attendants calling in and flight attendants' families calling in, but we didn't know anything at this point. And we were just answering the phones, just trying to calm people down. It was crazy. And I think at that point we were all in shock mode. We were just working. So Linda came back very shortly, and she called us all in the office, and she said, okay, everyone. She turned off the phones. She said flight 93 went down in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. We had known the crew very well. They had worked, it was the same crew that worked the flights, the constant The same people worked the same flights all the time for years, so we knew who was on the flights. Well, the phones came back to ringing again, and we were ordered not to say what flight it was, not to speak to the press, not to mention the names who were on the flights. But people were calling in so frantically, and they wanted to know who was on the flights, and they were guessing. Was it Allison? Was it this one? Was it that one? And people were guessing. And even when I went home, many, many hours later, I remember getting calls at home and flight attendants asking me, was so and so on this flight? Was so and so on the flight? And we couldn't acknowledge. We were told not to because the next of kins weren't located. So it was very, very difficult. Um, the next thing I remember was I kind of felt like a robot. We were kind of in just like forward mode. We just had to go forward. And I think we were all in shock at that point. You're just kind of working. And the next thing I remember was, let's see, after the flight crashed, the calls started coming in, and going going the next day, well, the next couple days, they had Red Cross come into the office, and they tried to they had stopped all air travel. They stopped all air travel, and flight attendants, once they started air travel again, all of our flights were landed in Canada, and Canadians opened up their homes to many of our flight attendants. So we were trying to locate all of our flights for days. We were trying to locate all of our crews for days, and the phones continued to ring. I remember working many, many hours for the next couple of days. And I remember when we evacuated the flight attendants that day on 9/11, trying to locate my children. They were in 3 schools, and we were so afraid, like, I remember a flight attendant saying to me when she evacuated, she said, "Oh my God," they called me Teresa. "Oh my God, Teresa, they're gonna bomb Newark. They're gonna bomb the airport." And, it didn't really phase me because I was like in shock mode. I said, "Just locate my children, get my children out of school for me, call my mother." And I wrote down the 3 kids' school numbers. I remember doing that. And my mother had my kids when I got home that night, my mother and her best friend. But we didn't go home till late that night. And I remember driving home on the turnpike, and it was so eerie. But I do know that many hours going back on 9/11, after answering the phones for many hours, it had to be dusk at this point. The terrorist task force agents came downstairs and they called for me, and this other guy, Thomas, who was on the desk with me, and they asked to speak to us, if they wanted to interrogate us, like interview us. So they walked us through the airport. It was the eeriest feeling I have ever had in my life, and I'll never forget it. Walking through Newark Airport, and they had evacuated Newark Airport at this point. It was probably sundown. And I remember walking through the airport, and all she saw was dogs and terrorist task force agents everywhere with guns, these guys with guns, armed guys everywhere through the airport. And you look to the right with the big picture windows in the airport, and you could just see the burning in New York, the smoke. It was like in a movie. And they walked us upstairs to the crisis center, United Airlines VIP lounge, where they were using as a crisis center. And they interrogated us for a long time for the calls that we took. And I'll never forget the terrorist task force agent's name, Jessie, and she was so wonderful to us. But I think we were in shock, and we were up there for many, many hours, and then I drove home that night. My supervisor came up and got me from that office and walked me back down to my office. And I very vaguely remember driving home that night on the turnpike back to my home. and going back to work. And I continued to work for many days and many, many hours after 9/11. And it really drastically affected me, but I continued to journal. And I, there were a lot of security alerts. Once air travel started to pick up, there were many FAA security alerts about people putting bombs in their zippers, and FAA security alerts. Um, People are putting bombs in their zippers. People are putting bombs in their shoes, and the flight attendants were flipping out. They were so scared to fly, and the Red Cross came in and they were counseling our flight attendants, and many of them went out on sick leave. And then I sent emails. I sent a mass email to all the flight attendants and crews as to where they were during 9/11. And I got a lot of feedback, and I put that all in my book. So I'm glad I wrote about it, because I had firsthand knowledge of everything, and I'm glad I journaled everything. And my book turned into being overcoming trauma and overcoming these hurdles. And I'm really glad I could tell my story today, because I've been keeping this to myself for so many years, and I think it's important to share um, that you can overcome trauma. I continued to work until January 17th, and on January 17th, I did have a nervous breakdown. The trauma hit me, the shock wore off, and the trauma set in, and I went on disability with United Airlines and workman's comp for many, many years. And I changed everything. My children were affected greatly by it. My son had to go live with his dad, and everything changed in my life. It really had a great impact on my life, as it did many people's lives. Many people were affected. Um, this year, the 20th anniversary, I would like to go back to the crash site. I would like to see it. I know it's a beautiful site today, and I would like to see the memorial. I'm hoping to overcome my fears and do that this year. Um, but I had a lot of love for the crew. Jason Dole and Leroy Homer were the pilots, and I had a lot of love for the flight attendants that were on that flight that day. And I really, all the flight attendants that went through this with me, I had a lot of love for them. And I'm really grateful to tell my story today. And I thank you so much for giving me the time to share this message.
Terry, when you say you had a nervous breakdown in January, what happened exactly?
Oh, Shelley, I was working so many hours, and I was trying to cheer up the office. I helped plan funerals. We had a funeral of over 500 people for all the flight attendants that perished in the Flight 93 crash, and I assisted in that. We had it at the Sheraton in Newark, and I assisted in planning that funeral. And I did so much work. I decorated the office for Christmas and everything, and I was just going on blind faith and energy. And I think I was in shock. They all kept telling me, slow down, Terry, get some help, get some therapy. And I thought, no, I'm fine. And then January 17th, I was in my shower, and I was getting ready to go to the airport, and my body just started trembling. I started crying uncontrollably, and I blacked out. My mother found me naked in my living room, and I was just unconscious. I just couldn't speak. And I was in such a bad state of mind. And they said it was such an emotional breakdown, that the trauma wore off, that the shock wore off, and the trauma set in. And it was pretty amazing. Like, I'm really believing a God. And, the doctor that they brought me to was a Dr. Frank Cancelleri, and he was an ex-terrorist task force agent. And it was pretty amazing to me. He was a psychiatrist in Riverview Hospital. And it was a real blessing to me. And I've been in therapy all these years, and I've really worked through it. I've worked through my trauma. I've been working very hard at getting better. And like I said, I was on workman's comp for many years with United, and now I'm on Social Security on a post-traumatic stress disorder. But I've come a long way.
How do you deal with that kind of trauma when you say that you've worked through it? I can't even imagine how that is even possible.
Well, I for years I wasn't able to talk about 9/11, Shelley. I really bottled it up, and I didn't even share with my kids. Like, my kids are going to really be anxious to hear my story, because I never really shared my story with my kids. They were 10, 12, 14, and 16 when 9/11 happened. And I never really had the chance to share with my kids exactly my involvement with 9/11. And my son Jason's listening today, and I hope he gets some insight, because he was greatly affected. My children were greatly affected by 9/11. I wasn't able to care for them. I went through depressions. I had really post-traumatic stress disorder. I was very sick. I went into addiction. I I overcame addiction. I so many things came up in my life through the past 20 years that I've overcome, and I've learned that I'm a survivor and I'm a fighter, and I'm a strong woman, and I have a God that helps me through things, and I'm getting through this.
Your sons didn't you say you wrote a book though. They didn't read the book?
No, because I still haven't published my book. Um,
Oh,
I have my book. Nobody's read my book. I kept it to myself, and I've been working on it for all these years. And I'm anxious to get it edited and published. I want to put it in a manuscript form and get it published. And I just needed some help with that.
well, I think this will be doing it. Jason is one son. How old was Jason at the time?
Jason was 14.
And your other son?
My other son was 10, and he had to go live with his dad at the time because I was not capable of taking care of him. I was in such a state of depression.
For how long?
Years.
Jason, do you want to jump on the video? And this is the first time you're hearing this?
I've heard bits and pieces of the story. I kind of have my own version in my head of what kind of went down. Without some of the details. I've heard a lot of different. Over the years, we have four family members, so we hear it different ways from each other. Um, as far as the whole story goes, I think from my perspective is right on the money. I know that my mom was an onboard service coordinator. I know that that one of her friends was sick and that she had to take that friend off and she had to replace someone on short notice. I know that there was some sort of conversations on a phone where, I don't know if it was whether the police, FBI, whoever it was, her direct boss, whoever she had to speak to, as far as what was going on. I know there was a lot of chaos and hectic moments and late nights and things like that. And I know there was a lot of depression that followed, and certainly affected us as a family. And without going into further detail, it was a long road ahead. And I think, it was a struggle for everyone in our family. I'm happy that my mom's doing well, happy that she is really doing great. She's standing on her own 2 feet again. So that's the most important thing for me and our family. I think we're all proud of her and where she's at, and I think that's kind of where I'm at. If you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them.
What do you remember from that day, Jason?
Well, I remember I was in my my teacher's, Miss Brinster's class. I remember getting called down to the main office. I was the first kid in the school to know before anyone, aside from the secretaries, because I guess my mom called, or I don't know who called at that time. Somebody reached out to us at the time. And I remember going down to the main office and getting the message that, the Trade Center had been hit and the Twin Towers had been hit, I'm sorry. And when I returned back to my class, when I was walking back to my classroom, as I walked down the hallways, all the TVs were turning on, and people were in like shock, and all people were in the hallways. People just began to get the message of what was going on. So every TV in the whole school was turned on to news and was watching the actions unfold. Now, to understand where we grew up is a small town called Keensburg, and it's directly across from the city. And when that began to happen, when we got out of school, there was probably about 100 kids that went down to what we call the Baywalk, and we saw the bellowing smoke over top of the bay, and it was just constant for days and days and days, where you can just see smoke all over the place. So it was pretty tough, especially in our area. We have a lot of like firemen and police and all that assisted in the efforts, and I know personal friends that have, their fathers have lost their lives, firemen and police officers, from cancer and things like that, throughout the years. So that's kind of what my recollection of it was. Me and my sister were in school together. My older sister were in school together, so we kind of linked up, and I think we ended up going home early that day. And just kind of were together, waiting for mom to get home. I think I was with my grandmother at the time.
And at what point did you realize that your mom had checked in the crew that was on Flight 93?
I think that wasn't until a few days later, until we everything kind of not settled down, but everything, she was able to get home and trying to be home with us and things like that. And then we had a better understanding of what was going on. I knew that because I'd been in her job a lot. We used to travel a lot, and I knew where her office was, and I knew what she did. So she had this little desk. It was like a high top desk, and I guess almost like chest width, my chest height. I guess at the time I was a little bit shorter, and it kind of sat above. And then there was a room in the back, I think. And there was always a secure door when you walk in. So it was a secure door, a little lobby, and then there was a couple computers there with a back room. And I remember going in there a few times. So from my memory and my imagination, I'm thinking about these flight attendants coming in, her having to go and link them in the computer and then send them off into the airport onto their flight. So that's kind of how I remember it. It's hard to look back and for me and to remember those things, because it wasn't for her, it was very significant. For me, it was, a part of my life that was just another piece of the puzzle. It's kind of, we did have a tough life, tough upbringing, and, the onset of all this. And, as my mom said, her addiction and then now to her recovery, it's been a long road. So it's been a lot of different types of trauma in our lives. And I'm not going to pretend that any of it was easy. Very difficult time. So.
Terry, you had 2 sons and 1 daughter. You have 2 sons and 1 daughter?
2 daughters and 2 sons.
Oh, 2 daughters and 2 sons. Okay. How many years were you paralyzed by this?
Up until 2 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you, Shelley.
Is there anything else you want to add, Jason or Terry?
I just feel so blessed that I'm able to be here and tell my story. And I feel such healing telling this story today. I really do. And I feel so blessed that my kids are in my life, and we have found peace from all this wreckage. And I just feel so blessed today. And I hope the families, all those little kids that grew up without their mothers, because all the flight attendants were women, and I hope these children are doing well today. And Leroy and Jason, the pilots, everybody, because you always hear about the victims of the towers, in New York, but you never talk about Shanksville. Anyone never talks about Shanksville and Flight 93 and the other flights. And they were very dear to my heart. But I'm so grateful and I'm so honored that you chose to do an interview with me, Shelley.
Well, I'm just so honored that you chose this forum to share your story, and bless and Yes. Thank you so much.